Hey guys, so as you can tell, I'm not here. I had a flat tire, so today I'm just going to give you a little lecture, an assignment to work on at the end of the period, and with any extra time you can prepare for the mock trial debate that we'll be having when I can be in school. So today we're going to talk about independence movements in Africa. And we're going to talk specifically about three. We're going to talk about Ghana, Kenya, and Algeria. So first we're going to talk this post-war trend. After World War II, there was an international movement to give up colonial holdings. So people didn't want colonies anymore, or they couldn't maintain those colonies. It was an expensive operation to have colonies. And there was also this fear in Europe of growing communism, that communism would come from Russia into Central Europe and maybe even Western Europe, and that the resources of the the resources of the European countries would be better served or better used preventing the rise of communism in Europe. So there's just a lot of other reasons, but there's this international trend where most colonies are really moving towards independence by the 1960s. And when you look at England's colonial holdings, they really do lose most of them in the decade following the end of World War II. Well, the decade and a half. But first we're going to talk about Ghana, which is the first real organized movement for independence. Ghana had always been significantly more successful than other British colonies. They were much more educated. Like half of the population, half of the children in Ghana were in, schools. They were going to England to study. They were coming back, and there was a very small population of British civilians in Ghana. It was mostly officials from the companies that were working there, or government or military officials. There were not a lot of people in England who were just like, "Hey, let's move to Ghana." It wasn't that common, and so just keep that in mind. As we talked about with World War I and also World War II, the colonial powers, so England used the human resources of the countries that they had colonized to fuel their war effort, to have more soldiers, because it's really, a matter of numbers. If you have more soldiers, you're more likely to win. So they had brought all of these soldiers, to Europe, and then they came back, and they had fought for England. They had seen sort of what they were fighting for in England or in Europe was independence, nationalism, and self-determination, and freedom from extra-national oppression. And so they start sort of leading this movement for nationalism. And the leader of that movement, the sort of official leader, is a guy named Kwame Nkrumah. So the transition from British rule to independent rule was much more peaceful than you're going to see it in other places. There was just a couple of violent protests. Well, there was one protest where the police, who were British, just fired into a crowd, killing 6 Ghanaians or Ghanans. And that's really the biggest instance of violence in the entire revolution. There was violent rioting, and I'm using air quotes there because it was demonstrations. It was, because they weren't getting their pension for being in the war. It was sort of made sense in context, but it was not violent in the way that we're going to see violence in these other movements. I think that's the point I'm making. They had arrested Nkrumah and the other leaders of the independence movement, but then released him in 1951, and the next day were like, hey, lead our government. The British basically handed over control from their regional controllers to Nkrumah, and created a government, an independent government with a constitution. And it's notable that the Ghanaian government, especially under Nkrumah, had at the beginning really cooperated with the British. They had a much more positive relationship, or much less hostile relationship with the British. All right, now we're going to talk about Mau Mau, which is one of the, I think, most interesting uprisings, but I might be wrong. Or, no, it's my opinion. Anyway, so Kenya differed from Ghana in that British people moved to Kenya. You could buy land for cents of what it, like a cent for a square mile. You could buy huge amounts of land for very little money. Lots of nobles who were poor or moving, like who had lost all their money, were moving to Kenya because they could make a new start. They could grow cash crops like coffee, tobacco, etc. They could just grow it there, sell it, and make huge amounts of money. And there was, British society was there. They had horse races, they had clubs, they had all this stuff. And they had gotten this land that the British had sold off for fractions of what it was actually worth. They had gotten it by just kicking native Kenyans off the land, and the ethnic group that was kicked off the land most sort of notably was the Kikuyu, because they're going to be the Mau Maus eventually. So they move all of these Kikuyu, and I can't remember the names of the other ethnic groups, but they move them to Nairobi, which is the big city. So now you have all of these people from different parts of the country living together in this one big city. And so just before we go more into the Mau Mau, let's talk for a second about revolutionary spirit, or revolutionary fever. It's this idea that there's a domino effect, that if one country has an uprising, then it will likely spread to other countries, especially if you think the idea that regionally countries are going to have similar issues. So much like France has a revolution that in 1848 spreads to other European countries, or if you look at the Arab Spring, an uprising in Tunisia spreads to Egypt and Syria and so on. This is the idea that the revolutionary fever, after Ghana gets independence, it inspires other African countries to work for independence or to push for independence. So there were protests in Nairobi, and there was this beginning of a call for independence. And I also should note that prior to the Mau Mau in 52, there had the colonization of Kenya had been pretty violent. So there was already resentment of the British going into this uprising. There was already violent retribution. So the British arrest all of the Kenyans that they can find in the city, and if they're Kikuyu, they send them into, they deport them. They kick them out of the city. They send them out into the forest, and then where the Kikuyu reform with some other people as the Mau Mau, which is the name of their revolution, and they use guerrilla tactics. They attack. In the night they attack civilians, and they. They're also in the area that they had previously been evicted from. So they're going back to where they were, and then they have more knowledge of the land than the British soldiers. The Mau Mau in the entire revolution, which lasts from 52 to 60, they kill 200 British soldiers and about 32 British civilians. So there is a substantial death toll, and they do target, in many cases, British civilians, just families living on their farms in Kenya. So the British reaction was to be as incredibly violent as they possibly could. The British killed about 12,000 of the Mau Mau, and they also used a policy called villagization, which is supposedly, the way that they were describing villagization was, we're going to help these Kenyans by putting them in modern European-style villages that will be much easier for them to live in, much safer, much healthier. What they were actually doing was moving the villages that had been used to supply the Mau Mau and holding them in, essentially, camps, like, that they could not leave from, holding them prisoner. Sorry, there was this argument about keys. Oh, here they are. Sorry, kids. So So they're holding people in these camps, not letting them go. So that's also holding them hostage. So they eventually, this becomes, again, this is a sort of a theme, more trouble than it's worth. And even though the rebellion is officially, or is sort of effectively ended in 1956, they do hand over in 1960. They give control of Kenya back to the Kenyans, and they begin this decolonization process. So this is much more violent than Ghana. All right, now we're going to very quickly talk about the Algerian War. So as we've seen in that video, France viewed their colonies as part of their country, more like, not officially, but they did see sort of every Algerian had the opportunity to eventually become French and to go to France and live in France. And so, but there was still a movement pushing for independence in Algeria. They wanted to be independent. So in 1954, there were some bombings done by independent activists that bombed a series of buildings. That's seen as the start of the Algerian War, which lasts from about 54 to 62, and both sides used just really sort of horrific methods. They use, counterterrorism, they use propaganda, and then they use terroristic methods, and sort of most notably, there is widespread use of torture on both sides. So this war made France look really bad on the national scale. So international opinion of France was incredibly low, and then even in France, support for that war was incredibly low. So eventually in 1962, de Gaulle, who was the president of France, basically says this is, again, more trouble than it's worth. We're gonna give this up, and it actually led to, people tried to kill him for it. And I think this is the last slide, but I'll just say that it's about 160,000 Algerians died in the war, as opposed to about 45,000 French soldiers. So it was the most deadly of the ones we've seen. It lasted the longest, and it was a war. It was a civil war as opposed to a revolutionary movement. It was a fighting between two sides. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about what I've just lectured you on. I'd like you to pick another African independence movement. So I would suggest either Guinea-Bissau or Mozambique or Namibia. And I'd like you to research, just do a quick read of how they got to have independence. And then I'd like you to create a graphic organizer, some visual way of understanding the differences and similarities between all of those movements. So why was the Algerian War more violent than the Kenyan movement? And why was the Kenyan movement more violent than Ghana? And what did Ghana have that made its movement less violent? Was it simply that it was first, or was it something else? And I will be on email during your class, and I just want to make sure, yeah, that's it. Wait, no, where'd it go? All right, have a wonderful day.